Hello, this is Grandmaster Bryan Smith with ChessLecture.com, and today we are going to be starting a series where I'll be examining some of the games that Magnus Carlsen played in the recent Open tournament, the Isle of Man Masters tournament in Isle of Man. This is, I thought, particularly interesting because with very few exceptions, I believe, Carlsen is almost the first world champion to play in open tournaments, Swiss system tournaments. Going back in the distant past, there weren't very many Swiss system tournaments, especially not at a high level, where round robins were primarily played. And the more recent world champions also didn't really compete in open tournaments at all. I think maybe the only exception might be Kasparov. I think played in the Soviet Championship when it was open, but I'm not even sure about that. So it was real interesting, though, to see Carlsen playing in an open tournament where you have to win most of your games in order to win the tournament, and nothing less than +5 or so, or +4 at least, would be a success for him. We see how he's able to beat fairly strong players, grandmasters, with both colors in this open tournament kind of format, which is something that lower level professional players are much more acquainted with, but to see Carlsen in it is kind of interesting. So I'm going to cover some of his wins. I'm not going to cover his game with fellow lecturer Eugene Perelstein, who's going to cover it himself, of course, and I probably won't cover his draws, but we're going to start off with his first round game against a player, I believe Icelandic, it looks like from the name, Bardur Birkisson, a player rated 2164 FIDE, so this was an enormous difference from Carlsen's rating. But in the days of so much, just ubiquitous amount of information in chess and very high level of play and lots of tournaments, players rated in amateur level can compete with world champions for some time, of course, as the game goes on. It's not necessarily the case that he's just going to get blown out in the opening, because there's just so much information out there, and it's not in every case that strong grandmasters even always win a game with players rated in this level. And sometimes especially some of these players are underrated as well. So it was interesting to see. So Carlsen had a white. He began with c4, knight f6, knight c3. e6, and he just transposed into Nimzo-Indian with d4 rather than going around and looking at this type of e4 and these systems with some forcing play and some simplifications early on. So he went just transpose into Nimzo-Indian after bishop b4, and here he's getting set for to play a solid but aggressive game. So we'll see. So black now he played e3. So this was a good system for that, keeping a lot of tension, a Rubinstein system, and he sort of slowly but builds up into a strong attack. So castles, knight f3. So he doesn't go for this knight e2 stuff either. b6. So black now goes into this system with which really is in line with the original ideas of the Nimzo-Indian, with Nimzovich's ideas to control the center from the distance with the pieces. Of course, many other possibilities, d5, c5, and so on. But he went b6, bishop d3, bishop b7, castles. And here this is, well, if black was going to play this stuff with knight e4, most likely he would have done it in a different move order where he's already played knight e4 instead of castling. So it's possible, of course, for him to take e4 and go knight e4 and try to get into this kind of system. This is one possibility. It's also possible to play c5, which is another main move, and then usually white's playing knight a4 to try to make black exchange on d4, and then, for instance, c takes d4 either to take back with the pawn immediately or to throw in a3. This is one other possibility, but black chose the most classical way of playing, d5, which is well regarded. I think I personally like the other systems more than this, but this is a very classical way of playing. So c takes d5 now, e takes d5, and here Carlsen played the most aggressive and direct move, knight e5, which is one of the things I always kind of didn't like the system as black because first this is one where it's theoretically black should get counterplay, should have enough counterplay, but it's a little hard to meet white's direct play on the king side. His plan is to play basically in a style that's Pillsbury played back in the early 20th century, putting the knight on e5, supporting it with f4, not in this exact position, usually in a queen's gambit declined, because back then there was not really a Nimzo-Indian opening, basically didn't exist, but this plan, and then for instance a rook lift with rook f3 to h3, and just growing pressure on the king side, supported by this strong knight on e5, which is hard for black to eliminate. That said, black was getting counterplay and uses the e4 square himself. So there's, and it's possible that if Carlsen was playing against a higher rated player, he might have used this other system with a3 and then b4 with some sort of pressure on the queen side. And black faces some problems here as well. For instance, queen to b3. It's typical, and then there's this idea of rook a2 to e2 and trying to push e4 at a specific point, and it's a little hard for black to occupy e4 and keep his knight there, because sometimes white can prepare to take d5. It will be hard for black to keep just jumping the knight to e4. Of course, white can't take d5 now because of the tactic of bishop takes h2 after the queen is drawn to d5, but the knight isn't very stable on e4, because then, for instance, if black tries to play knight d7, then white can take later. So that black faces some problems there in this line as well. And it's possible that Carlsen would have chosen that against one of closer to his level players, but against a lower-rated player, it was very natural and it would be expected for him to play this direct system, knight e5. So black played knight to d7 here. There's some other possibilities, and you could say that perhaps the knight, it would be better to aim it for c6, where it would put some counter pressure against d4. So if black could get, for instance, c5 and knight c6, and white will have to deal with defense of the d4 pawn, some undermining of the knight on e4. However, there's some problem, for instance, c5 immediately, that leaves this bishop a little bit stranded. So if there's moves like knight to e2, and now there's threat to play a3, black would have to release the tension on the center to enable the bishop to retreat, and or maybe bishop f5 here, and this becomes a very sharp battle with white's pressing on the king side with the pieces and maybe pushing some f-pawn, for instance. e4 also comes into white's plans to open the dark square bishop. But black also has his play because he has this majority on the queen side. Very sharp game. So that's one possibility. Also, black could try moving his bishop back. This is more common, but he spends a tempo, of course, and then to play c5 and bring the knight to c6, where it provides some pressure against d4, which makes it a little bit harder for white to directly attack. And usually at the right moment, black can occupy e4 with a knight, which would cut out white's light squared bishop when the attack gets too serious. So that's another possibility. But black chose knight to d7, which is also okay. The knight may not be as actively placed on d7, but sometimes it could support the other knight on e4 by going to f6. And this doesn't require black to waste a tempo with bishop d6 before playing c5. So okay, white played f4, and now I think black made his first, what I would consider an inaccuracy. He jumped a little too early into e4, I think. This allows white to trade on e4 and block that square, and the rest of his pieces are very active then. So there are some, looks like, more promising possibilities. So one example is how Sergei Karyakin handled this position. He's one of the players who plays this frequently as black, and so he played c5, very natural, bishop d2, and now he played a5, just supporting this bishop and keeping his options open. And maybe this would come into his play later, or he also just generally prepares for queenside push, and also now there won't be discoveries by knight on c3, for instance. So a5, and white played this bishop f5. I'm not so sure that this play was the most promising here. There were some other moves white could try. Things like many moves, of course. Rook c1, king h1, maybe rook f3. But he played bishop f5, g6, and now white just decided to trade the bishop. So bishop takes, knight takes. And now a3, so he forced the trade of the other bishop. Bishop takes, and now c4, of course, keeping the long diagonal closed. And after f5, knight f6, white's attack. Now the knight comes to e4, and white looks like black has some weaknesses on the king side, but it's not. Once the knight comes to e4, it's really that knight is very strongly placed, and white doesn't have an easy way to directly attack black. Meanwhile, the bishop on c3 is not a very good piece. Black ended up winning this game. This was Shimoyev versus Karyakin from Nizhny Novgorod, 2013. So that's some better play. That I think more promising play for black. But instead, Carlsen's opponents just jumped into e4 right away. So knight takes e4, d takes e4. Now this e4 square is blocked by this pawn, which doesn't really give black that much benefit compared to Karyakin's knight that he got to e4 in the game we just saw, the excerpt we just saw. This pawn is just blocking that square. And white's bishop is very well placed, and it's hard for black to remove this knight now also. There's a lot of pressure on f7. White has some possibilities on both sides of the board, and black doesn't have a lot of counterplay. Of course, taking the knight simply with black's knight would be generally met by f takes e5, opening the f file. So I think white can claim at least some advantage now. So black played queen e7, reasonable move. In a few games that have reached this position, black usually played this move, but okay, it doesn't really, neither move is particularly anything important. So he played queen e7, and here some people might be tempted to go for some kind of direct play. For instance, queen a4, which gains white the two bishops after knight f6, because okay, black shouldn't exchange on e5. So knight f6 is logical. Now white has knight c6, and either black can take it, or he could play a tricky, probably better queen to d7, giving up the dark squared bishop instead. So this is probably better than bishop takes c6, and the queen takes b4, bishop takes c6, and white's gained the two bishops, but black's position is almost equal, I think. He'll put a bishop on d5 and c6, and white's bishop has a long road to get into the game. I think black's position is perfectly acceptable. So instead of doing some forcing, overly active thing like that, or maybe something on the king side, I'm not sure what, queen h5 or whatever, instead Carlsen simply built up the game with a3, bishop d6, b4. So he just gained some space on the queen side, and he prepares to develop the bishop to b2. So just a calm build-up, and the bishop will be well placed on b2. The long diagonal can open up, as we'll see in this game, very easily. So white not only has some possibilities on the queen side, on the c file, with the space over there, but of course lots of pieces aimed at the black king side. The one downside of this is that it could weaken white's queen side a little bit. It becomes a little bit vulnerable to this push a5, and that's something white will have to deal with. So played b4, knight f6, and now bishop to b2. Simply just building up. And here black played c6. This move I think is pretty ugly. I don't like that move at all. I think it's much better to just go bishop d5. This is very logical. You'll see that's what black did. Okay, he has a plan with c6 and then b5 and a5 to try to open the queen side, but he's condemning this bishop to a very miserable life. So instead bishop d5. And if white trades to try to claim that he has something on the light squares on the queen side, I don't think he really I don't think he can do a lot with it. He can maybe put a knight on c6, but it still doesn't achieve that much, and he has to. Meanwhile, this bishop is very bad, and this pawn is hanging, so even black might be able to just take on e5 even and be close to equal. Or even after white protects e3, black might even be able to just push c5 even. That's also possibility. So it's not so clear that this is the trading the bishops is that promising for white. Also, another point is, yeah, queen b3 I guess is possible, because if queen e6, the idea would be threatening knight f4, but maybe white can play f5. White can play f5 here, and then the knight is hanging, so that doesn't work. But yeah, black is fighting here at least. So I don't think that white has too much. The knight can move from just to d7, something like that, and black has a reasonable game. Maybe he would have played that. The other possibility was bishop a6, which leaves this important bishop on the board, and white tries to build up some play on the c file. And it's also, black doesn't have a lot of, this is probably what he would have preferred. It looks a little bit more promising than taking on d5. White has some advantage here, but at least black is not really condemning himself to this terrible bishop. He played c6. Queen to c2, again, calm build-up. White just brings the queen, pressures this pawn on e4, so now black has to watch that he can't move his knight away, and he also pressures on the c file. Black played now b5. So it was, this move also creates new weaknesses, and he could play a5 immediately, which looks more natural. Because b5, if white played it, if that was the reason why black wanted to play b5 first, this is no good for white. After takes and rook to c8, black has plenty of play. Now knight is coming to d5, black has excellent game actually. So that wouldn't be the answer, I don't think. So most likely Carlsen would have either taken on a5 or played like he did, similar to the game with bishop e3, but black gained some, whereas he's sacrificing a pawn, black gains some options. Well, it's not even really a sacrifice, because c6 is under attack, but black will protect c6, and of course black gained some options compared to the game. He doesn't play b5, so I think this was a5 again was a little better. It was better. So he played b5, and now bishop to b3, and now a5. That's black's idea. So he's trying to get some counterplay, and that's of course what he should do. And here Carlsen made an interesting little move. Okay, so if he takes c6 immediately, black would take and knight to g4. And this is real annoying for white to deal with, this threat to e3 and possibilities like queen h4 coming. So if white protects with this rook, then queen h4 threatens f2 and h2. So that's not good for white. It's actually pretty awkward to protect the pawn on e3. And you don't want to play bishop c1. You don't want to have to play rook a to e1. This might be what he has to do, but then black is taking pawn here, and the bishop's going to be hitting the rook on e1. So it's so for this reason Carlsen played h3, just sacrificing this pawn on b4. But we'll see that he gets more than enough for it. But this leads to some kind of semi-forcing play. It was also possible to just take on a5, and here white should be better also, because even though he'll have a weak pawn on a3, black's bishop is so bad on b7. And white always has this play on the king side as well, pressure on f7. That was possible, but so h3 he played. Tricky little move, and black took on b4, which was logical. He takes b4, and now bishop takes b4, which was probably the decisive mistake. It was, of course, a consequent continuation of black's play, but it turns out to give white's attack grows too quickly after this move. So what he needed to do is instead to put the knight on d5 and try to take with the knight on b4, where it's protecting c6. Either to do this or to possibly exchange right away on a1, but it probably makes sense to just go knight d5 first. So now there's a threat to this pawn, and of course white doesn't want to take d5. So white should begin with rook takes a8, when black has to recapture with the bishop, because otherwise the pressure on f7 would be, which would limit black's possibilities. So bishop takes a8, and now queen takes e4. This is what I mean. Otherwise, white doesn't have anything he can really do. And e3 is hanging, and b4 also. So queen takes e4, and here black has f6. And there are several ways that white can save the piece. He can move the queen away, and when black takes on e5, white's going to regain the piece with e4. First take on e5, of course, attacking the bishop, and then e4, regaining the piece. Or he can do such things like bishop to c2, protecting the queen and threatening h7, and then after black defends, then move the knight away. So white's not losing a piece. The problem is, though, that all of these things involve some simplification, and black gets at least good chances to draw in most cases. So for instance, the best move I think it looks like is rook a1 after f6, with the threat to take on a8 and take on d5, and then fork the king and rook. So black has to step the king away from this line with king h8. It's also possible to play bishop e7, stopping the rook from capturing, but then, for instance, queen f3. Now white can save the piece this way, and if black takes, then here white takes on e5, threatening the bishop, and then e4 comes next, and white gets a big advantage. So instead black would have to take the king off the diagonal with king h8, now threatening to take the knight, and then white has to save the knight with knight to g4, which also protects e3, and black can take on b4, and he's probably okay here, or maybe even, yeah. So instead, maybe knight to d3, or sorry, bishop takes d5. If white tries bishop takes d5 first, he takes d5, and then knight to d3. This also, now bishop takes b4, and again there's this simplification, opposite colored bishops, and there's no knight takes b4 and bishop a3, because queen c3 attacks the rook. So that doesn't quite work. Yeah, maybe knight to g4 here. But black also then can just take on b4, or yeah. So it's still a tough struggle there, and also after rook a1, king h8 is possible. Just take, which is looks more useful because it's taking the king off of that diagonal, which it has to in every case. Here, white could white would play bishop c2 to regain to keep the piece, because it protects the queen. g6, and then knight to g4. And here again, black has some things he can, for instance, take it, and then he can, with f5 or h5, he can maybe h5 to keep e5 protected. And now the e3 pawn is hanging if the knight moves. If white takes on d5, then black takes back, and then knight moves, and then bishop takes b4, and rook a7. Okay, it can go on from here, but it's maybe, yeah, it's some advantage for white, but it was definitely a much better chance for black. So instead he just took on b4 with the bishop, which gives white a full possession of the initiative. So now rook takes a8. Black has to take with the bishop, because otherwise f7 is captured if the rook takes. So bishop takes a8, rook a1. So now white's down a pawn, but c6 is hanging, and there's threats to f7. Black is tied to that pawn, and white has a big threat to remove black's worst piece, in fact, which we'll see in a second. So here, black should actually stop white's threat with bishop b7, but after knight takes c6, bishop takes c6, queen takes c6, white's pieces are completely dominating. The queen is extremely powerful. The bishop on b3 is an enormous piece, and rook occupies the open file. White has strong center pawns past d pawn. The b5 pawn is weak, so it's just basically overwhelming advantage. But at least black wouldn't lose immediately that way. He played knight to d5 instead, which attacks this pawn and looks more active. But now, ironically, that this bishop was such a bad piece, but it's often the case that in a bad position, that a terrible bishop is what has to be destroyed in order to finally break through. As they say, bad bishops defend good pawns. Okay, the pawn on c6 isn't very good, but it's still holding black's position together, defending the knight and keeping white's pieces out. So Carlsen now sacrificed the exchange, removing that bishop, the defender of black's light squares. So rook takes a8, rook takes a8, and now queen takes c6. So he attacks the rook and the knight. Of course, black's only move is knight c7, and black stays up the exchange. So no doubt Carlsen saw knight takes c6 wins material immediately after the queen has to move and protect the knight. Then bishop takes removes the defender of the bishop, and then white takes here with two pieces, and with two pieces for a rook. White's definitely winning here, and also white can take e4. So for instance, queen c4, white doesn't have to go into the ending because this hits the rook, so white's able to take that pawn. And white's easily winning, but Carlsen probably wanted to finish the game in a direct attack rather than in that way, and so his choice was understandable to play queen takes c6, keep this powerful knight rather than trading it off, or rather than moving it around to b4 to win material, keep the important bishop rather than trading it off, and just his pieces will dominate now. So knight to c7, black protects the knight and the rook at the same time. Now bishop takes f7 check, king h8, and queen takes c4. So that's compared to the position where white had two pieces for a rook. Here it's still technically equal material. White has two pawns for the exchange, but he has absolute control over the center, and the black king is not safe, and black has poorly placed pieces everywhere, vulnerable pieces, and also white has two connected passed pawns and a third pawn that can help them to advance as well. So this is a winning position for white, and probably more enjoyable to play out than the one that he rejected with the two pieces for a rook. So here black played rook f8, and now came d5. So this was a very, no doubt Carlsen was hoping to finish the game with, for instance, if black's bishop is not under attack, but it's vulnerable, and as we'll see after black takes on f7, it'll be hanging. So if black tries to move the bishop out of the way, then white's plan is knight to g6 check to finish the game with a bang here. Knight to g6, h takes g6, bishop takes g7 check, king takes g7, queen g6, king h8, queen h6 mate. So that's the combination he had planned, and his opponent probably saw it, played rook takes f7, but now his position is hopeless. White just goes up a pawn and quickly a second pawn, and the game is over. So the best chance technically was knight to e8, which defends g7, so it stops that combination, and it prepares to somehow to bring the knight to d6, for instance. So, however, after bishop to e6, white's position is still overwhelming. It's threat of knight to c6 first of all. If black goes bishop d6, then knight to d7, and white just regains the exchange with an extra two pawns. Black could play some other moves, but white's position is just overwhelming, just like before, with an enormous centralization of his pieces and the passed pawns. It's a hopeless game for black, but that was technically the best chance. So instead, rook takes f7, black played. Knight takes f7, queen takes f7, queen takes b4. So that was the point. And now black took on d5 with the knight. Of course, the queen couldn't take because of checkmate on f8, so he took with the knight. White took on b5. Black took on e3. So it's still only one pawn for now at the moment, but Carlsen had seen further. Black has problems on the long diagonal in the back rank, so there's another simple combination here. Queen to b8 check, queen to g8, only move, and now bishop takes g7. So nice little finish here. Black has to take with the king, and now queen e5. So white wins a second pawn, and this is easily winning. with 2 extra pawns, even though it's queen ending, it's still a very simple one. So they played a few more moves, and now black resigned since white's just getting ready to push the f pawn, and he will be able to trade queens. So threats of trading queens, white will win with great ease. So I thought this was enjoyable, interesting to watch how the world champion takes on a player who's nowhere even close to his level. But it's not easy to beat anyone practically or to be certain of beating anyone in an easy game today, because there's just so much information out there in chess, and so many people have chances to play a lot and get experience quickly. So no opponent is a pushover anymore. And so we see how Carlsen is able to deal with it, what was normally a scenario that was only found in the early rounds of the Olympiads, when top teams would play against players from countries that don't have much chess, so there would sometimes be this kind of matchup, but this was basically the only time it was seen was in the Olympiad. So this has been Grandmaster Bryan Smith with ChessLecture.com. Have a good day.